The morning mist clung to the Colorado high country like the breath of sleeping spirits, rising from the valley floor in ghostly tendrils that caught the first rays of dawn. Jake Morrison rode his paint horse along the narrow mountain trail, the leather of his saddle creaking with each step as they picked their way through the rocks and scrub pine that dotted the rugged landscape. At 28, Jake was a man shaped by the frontier, lean and weathered from years of working cattle drives and mining claims, with calloused hands and eyes that had learned to read the subtle signs of danger that could mean the difference between life and death in this unforgiving country. Jake had been riding for 3 days, following a trail that seemed to lead nowhere, searching for strays from the herd he was driving to market in Denver. The late summer roundup had been harder than usual, with cattle scattered across miles of rough terrain by early storms that had blown down from the peaks. Most of the missing animals had been accounted for, but a handful of the most valuable breeding stock was still missing, and Jake's boss, old Samuel Hartwell, had made it clear that he expected every head to be found before winter set in. Hartwell was a hard man but a fair one, the kind of rancher who had built his fortune through grit and determination rather than luck or inheritance. He had given Jake his start in the cattle business 5 years ago, recognizing something in the young drifter that others had missed. A combination of natural horseman skills and unshakable integrity that made him valuable in a business where trust was often more important than talent. The country Jake was riding through was some of the most remote in Colorado territory, a place where few white men ventured and even fewer stayed long. These mountains had been sacred to the Ute people for countless generations, a place where they came to seek visions and commune with the spirits of their ancestors. Jake had heard the stories from old-timers who claimed to have seen things in these hills that couldn't be explained. Lights that danced in the darkness, voices that carried on the wind, and ancient powers that still moved through the stone and timber. But Jake was a practical man who put little stock in such tales. He had grown up on a hardscrabble farm in Kansas, where survival depended on hard work and common sense rather than mystical beliefs. His father had been a stern Methodist who viewed Indian spiritual practices as nothing more than heathen superstition, and Jake had inherited much of that skepticism, even if he had left the religious fervor behind. The mountains might be beautiful and dangerous, but they were still just rock and dirt and trees to him, obstacles to be overcome rather than spirits to be feared or revered. He had learned to read the weather signs and animal tracks, to find water in country that looked bone dry, to navigate by the stars when trails disappeared in the darkness. These were practical skills based on observation and experience, not mystical communion with unseen forces. His horse was a sturdy paint gelding named Ranger, an animal with cow sense and mountain stamina that Jake had trained himself from a green-broke 3-year-old. The horse moved with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that had learned to trust his rider's judgment, responding to the slightest pressure of knee or rein as they navigated the treacherous terrain. It was mid-morning when Jake found the first sign of the missing cattle, fresh tracks leading down into a narrow canyon that cut deep into the heart of the mountains. The tracks were clear enough in the soft earth near a seasonal stream, 5 or 6 head moving together, probably seeking water and shelter from the storms that had been sweeping through the area for the past week. Jake urged Ranger down the steep trail, following the hoofprints as they wound between towering walls of red sandstone that rose like cathedral spires toward the sky. The canyon was deeper than it had appeared from above, and as Jake descended, he found himself in a world apart from the open country he had been riding. The walls closed in around him, creating a sense of isolation and mystery that made Ranger nervous and set Jake's own nerves on edge. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock faces, carved by hands that had been dust for centuries, telling stories in symbols that no living man could fully understand. Jake had seen Indian rock art before, but nothing as extensive or well-preserved as this. The images seemed to dance in the shifting light and shadow of the canyon, hunters pursuing buffalo, warriors on horseback, strange figures that might have been shamans or spirits or something in between. The cattle tracks led deeper into the canyon, following a stream that bubbled and sang over smooth stones, worn by countless years of running water. Jake could see where the animals had stopped to drink, and where they had bedded down for the night in the shelter of overhanging rocks. But the trail was old, at least 2 days, and there was no sign of the cattle themselves. The canyon branched and divided like the fingers of a giant hand, creating a maze of passages that could hide an army if they knew the secret ways. Jake followed the clearest set of tracks, but as the morning wore on, he began to suspect that the missing animals had either found their way out through some passage he couldn't see, or had been taken by predators that left no trace of their work. It was approaching noon when Jake decided to turn back. He had explored as much of the canyon system as was practical, and continuing deeper would only risk getting lost himself. The tracks he had been following had finally disappeared on bare rock that showed no sign of passage, and he was beginning to think that the cattle had somehow found their way back to the main herd on their own. He was climbing back up toward the canyon rim when he saw it. Half hidden in a pile of fallen rocks, something caught the midday sun and threw it back in flashes of gold and turquoise. Jake dismounted and walked closer, pushing aside loose stones until he could see what had caught his attention. What he found made him catch his breath in wonder and confusion. It was a ceremonial staff, about 4 feet long and elaborately decorated with feathers, beads, and carved symbols that seemed to tell some ancient story. The main shaft was made from what looked like eagle bone, polished to a warm ivory color, and inscribed with intricate designs that had been filled with gold and silver. Sacred stones were bound to the staff with sinew, turquoise, obsidian, and jade that seemed to glow with inner light even in the shadows of the canyon. At the top of the staff was the most remarkable feature, a carved thunderbird with wings spread wide, its eyes made from perfect amber that seemed to look directly into Jake's soul. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, speaking of generations of skilled artisans who had poured their hearts and spirits into creating something that was clearly far more than mere decoration. Every element of the staff spoke of sacred purpose and deep spiritual meaning. Eagle feathers hung from leather thongs, each one perfectly preserved and arranged according to some pattern that Jake couldn't decipher, but that clearly held great significance. Smaller carvings covered every inch of the shaft. Animals, celestial symbols, and human figures engaged in what looked like ceremonial dances or rituals. Jake had seen Indian artifacts before, had even traded for some of the simpler items when he encountered friendly tribes on his travels. But this was different. This was clearly a sacred object, something that belonged in the most important ceremonies of whatever tribe had created it. The weight of it in his hands felt almost alive, as if it carried some spark of the power that had been invested in it by its makers. The workmanship was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The bone had been carved with such precision that it felt more like polished marble than animal remains, and the inlaid metals caught the light in ways that seemed almost magical. The stones weren't just decorative. They had been chosen and placed according to some spiritual logic that spoke of deep understanding of their properties and meanings. For a moment, Jake considered simply leaving it where he had found it. He wasn't superstitious, but even he could recognize that this staff was probably sacred to someone, and taking it might be seen as theft or desecration. But as he looked around the empty canyon, he realized that the object had probably been lost during some kind of accident or conflict. If he left it here, it might never be found by its rightful owners, might be destroyed by weather or wild animals, or worse, might be found by someone who would see only its material value. The decision came suddenly, almost without conscious thought. Jake carefully wrapped the staff in his spare blanket and secured it to his saddle, telling himself that he would find a way to return it to its proper owners when he got back to civilization. Surely someone in Denver or one of the trading posts would know which tribe it belonged to and how to get it back to them. But even as he made this rationalization, Jake felt a strange uneasiness settle over him. The canyon seemed different now, more watchful, as if unseen eyes were following his every move. Ranger snorted and danced nervously, clearly picking up on some tension that Jake couldn't identify. The wind, that had been barely noticeable before, now seemed to carry voices, whispers in a language he couldn't understand, but that somehow sounded like warnings. The petroglyphs on the canyon walls seemed more vivid now, as if the act of taking the staff had somehow awakened the ancient images. Jake found his eyes drawn to a particular panel that showed a figure holding what looked remarkably like the staff he had just found, surrounded by dancers and what might have been spirit animals. The similarity was so striking that it sent a chill down his spine. Jake spent the rest of the day trying to follow the cattle trail out of the canyon system, but the tracks eventually disappeared on rocky ground that held no clear sign. As evening approached, he was forced to admit that the missing animals had either found their way out of the mountains on their own or had been taken by predators. Either way, there was nothing more he could do, and it was time to head back to the main herd. But leaving the canyon proved more difficult than he had expected. The maze of passages that had seemed relatively straightforward on the way in now seemed to shift and change, leading him in circles or ending in dead-end box canyons that he was sure hadn't been there before. By the time the sun began to set, Jake was thoroughly lost and beginning to worry that he might have to spend the night in this strange place. He made camp that night in a sheltered alcove where ancient peoples had obviously stopped before him. The walls were covered with more petroglyphs, and he could see the remains of old fire rings where countless generations had warmed themselves and cooked their meals. As he built his own fire and prepared a simple dinner of beans and hardtack, Jake found his eyes constantly drawn to the wrapped staff lying beside his saddle. In the firelight, the bundle seemed to pulse with some inner life, and Jake had the strange feeling that he was being watched by more than just the usual nocturnal creatures of the mountains. Every sound seemed amplified: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the pines, the distant howl of a coyote. Ranger remained nervous throughout the evening, ears constantly pricked and eyes rolling white whenever they fixed on the wrapped staff. The night seemed endless, filled with dreams that weren't quite dreams and sounds that weren't quite sounds. Jake found himself waking repeatedly, each time with the clear sense that something important was happening just beyond the edge of his perception. Sometimes he thought he heard drums beating in the distance, or voices singing in harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. When he finally managed to sleep deeply, his dreams were filled with strange images: soaring eagles, thunderstorms that shook the mountains, and ancient ceremonies conducted by painted figures who danced around sacred fires. In one particularly vivid dream, he saw the staff in its proper place, held by a medicine man whose face was painted with symbols of power, while an entire tribe gathered around him in respectful silence. Jake woke before dawn with the clear feeling that something had changed during the night. The very air seemed different, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle and his hair stand on end. Ranger was wide awake and alert, staring fixedly up the canyon walls, as if watching something that Jake couldn't see. As the first light of morning began to filter into the canyon, Jake heard it. The sound of many horses moving through the rocks above him, their hooves making almost no noise on the stone, but their presence unmistakable to anyone who knew how to listen. The sound was deliberate and organized, not the random movement of wild animals, but the carefully coordinated approach of experienced riders. Jake quickly rolled up his blankets and saddled Ranger, his hands moving with the automatic efficiency of a man who had learned that preparation could mean the difference between life and death. He checked his rifle and made sure his sidearm was loose in its holster, though he had no intention of starting a fight if it could be avoided. The climb out of the canyon took longer than expected, as Jake found that the trail he had descended the previous day seemed to have changed during the night. Passages that he remembered as clear and easy were now blocked by fallen rocks, while new paths had apparently opened up in places where he was sure there had been solid walls before. He climbed steadily toward the rim, following what seemed to be the most logical route, while the sounds of movement above him grew more distinct. By the time he reached the top, the sun was cresting the peaks, painting the mountainside in shades of gold and crimson that took his breath away. What he saw when he emerged from the canyon made him stop dead in his tracks. Spread across the mountainside before him were at least 50 Ute warriors on horseback, arranged in a long line that stretched as far as he could see in both directions. They sat motionless as statues, their horses breathing steam in the cold morning air, waiting with the patience of people who had learned that all things came to those who knew how to watch and wait. The warriors were magnificent to behold, dressed in traditional clothing that spoke of ancient customs and deep spiritual beliefs. Their faces were painted with symbols that Jake didn't recognize, but that clearly held great meaning, and many carried weapons that had been decorated with feathers and beads, in patterns that seemed to tell stories of great deeds and sacred visions. Each warrior was clearly a veteran, bearing the scars and bearing of men who had proven themselves in battle and earned the respect of their people. Their horses were equally impressive, painted ponies and mustangs that had been trained to respond to the slightest touch, animals that could run all day across impossible terrain and still have the strength to charge into battle. At the center of the line sat a figure who was clearly their leader, an older man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who had earned the respect of his people through wisdom and courage. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers that flowed down his back like a river of gold and brown, and his chest was decorated with an intricate beadwork breastplate that caught the morning light and threw it back in patterns that seemed to shift and dance. The chief's face was painted with symbols that spoke of great spiritual power, lightning bolts across his cheeks, a thunderbird on his forehead, and other designs that seemed to move and change in the shifting light. His eyes were dark and intelligent, missing nothing as they took in every detail of Jake's appearance and equipment. As Jake rode toward them, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and awe, the chief raised his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful greeting. When Jake was close enough to speak without shouting, the older man urged his horse forward, his movements formal and ceremonial. "I am Chief Running Elk of the Mountain Ute," the man said in careful English, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ceremony. "We have come for what you carry." Jake felt his heart skip a beat as he realized that somehow these warriors knew about the staff he had found. But how could they know? He had been alone in the canyon, and he was sure that no one had seen him take the sacred object. Unless the stories about these mountains were true, unless there really were powers at work here that operated according to rules he didn't understand. "I don't understand," Jake said, though even as the words left his mouth he knew they were a lie. He understood perfectly well what the chief was talking about. Running Elk smiled, and Jake was surprised by the warmth and dignity in the older man's weathered features. There was no hostility in his expression, no threat of violence, only a kind of patient certainty that spoke of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen and was prepared to wait for it to unfold naturally. "You carry the thunder staff of our people," he said simply, his voice carrying easily in the still mountain air. "It has been lost for many seasons, taken during a raid by our enemies from the north. We have searched for it in many places, followed many false trails, consulted with medicine men, and sought visions from the spirits. But last night, the spirits told us it had been found by one with a good heart." Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How did you know?" "The staff calls to its people," Running Elk explained, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing ancient wisdom. When it is near, those who know how to listen can hear its voice. Last night, it sang louder than it has in many moons, singing of one who found it and treated it with respect, who wrapped it carefully and intended to see it return to its rightful place. The chief gestured toward the wrapped bundle secured to Jake's saddle. You could have left it in the canyon, thinking it was just another piece of Indian curiosity. You could have sold it to traders who would not know its true value, who would see only the gold and stones and not the spirit that lives within. But you chose to take it with you, to protect it until it could be returned to its rightful place. This speaks well of your character, shows that you have the kind of heart that recognizes what is sacred. Jake found himself dismounting and walking toward his saddle, his hands shaking slightly as he untied the bundle that contained the staff. As he unwrapped it in the morning sunlight, he heard a murmur run through the assembled warriors, a sound that spoke of reverence and joy and something deeper than words could express. The staff seemed different in the mountain light, more alive somehow, as if being in the presence of its own people had awakened something that had been sleeping. The carved thunderbird at its tip seemed to turn its amber eyes toward the assembled warriors, and the sacred stones bound to its shaft caught the light and threw it back in patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," Running Elk said, as Jake held the staff toward him, his voice thick with emotion. "It was made by the greatest medicine man our people have ever known, a man called Thunderwalker, who could call down lightning from the sky and speak with the voices of the dead. He crafted it over many years from materials that were gathered from the most sacred places in our territory, eagle bone from the highest peaks, stones from the deepest caves, metals from veins that run through the heart of the world." The chief's eyes grew distant as he spoke, as if he were seeing events that had taken place long before his birth. Thunderwalker worked on the staff for 7 years, investing it with power through ceremonies that lasted for days, feeding it with sacred smoke and the blood of offerings. When it was finished, it held the power of the thunderbird, the strength of the eagle, the wisdom of the ancestors who had gone before. Running Elk dismounted and approached Jake, his movements formal and ceremonial. But as he drew near, his expression changed, becoming more personal and less ritualistic. "But you will not simply give it back to us," he said, and Jake felt a moment of confusion until he saw the smile in the older man's eyes. "Among our people, when someone performs a great service, when they show honor and respect for what is sacred, they must be properly thanked. To do less would be to dishonor both the gift and the giver." What followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced, even in his wildest dreams about the Old West. The ceremony was elaborate and formal, conducted according to traditions that were older than written history, following patterns that had been established by the ancestors and handed down through countless generations. The warriors began to ride forward one by one, each carrying a gift that they presented to the bewildered cowboy. A young brave offered him a magnificent war shield made from buffalo hide and decorated with symbols of protection and power. The designs painted on the shield told the story of a great battle where the spirits had intervened to save the tribe from destruction, and the warrior explained in halting English that it would protect Jake from all forms of harm. An elder presented him with a sacred pipe carved from red stone, its bowl decorated with silver inlay work, and its stem wrapped with the finest buckskin. The old man spoke for several minutes in Ute, his words translated by Running Elk, explaining that the pipe had belonged to a great peace chief and would ensure that Jake's words would always be heard with respect by all peoples. The gifts kept coming in an endless procession of generosity that left Jake increasingly overwhelmed. Blankets woven in patterns that told the stories of great hunts and battles, each thread carrying the memories of the women who had created them. Weapons decorated with silver and brass inlay work, their handles carved with symbols of courage and honor. Jewelry made from turquoise and bear claws that spoke of spiritual power and connection to the natural world. A war chief presented him with a magnificent lance, its shaft decorated with eagle feathers and coup marks that recorded the great deeds of its previous owner. The weapon was a work of art as much as an instrument of war, every detail carefully crafted to reflect the warrior culture that had created it. A medicine man approached with a small leather pouch that he placed around Jake's neck with great ceremony, explaining through gestures and broken English that it contained herbs and sacred items that would protect him from harm and bring him good fortune. The pouch itself was decorated with beadwork that seemed to shift and change in the light, creating patterns that were both beautiful and somehow unsettling. Another warrior gave him a war bonnet that was clearly a treasure of the tribe, made from the finest eagle feathers and decorated with ermine tails and beadwork that must have taken years to complete. The headdress was so elaborate and beautiful that Jake felt almost guilty accepting it, knowing that it represented wealth and status beyond anything he could ever hope to earn. But it was Running Elk's gift that moved Jake the most. The chief approached leading a horse, a magnificent painted stallion with the intelligent eyes and proud bearing that spoke of the finest Indian breeding. The animal was clearly valuable beyond measure, the kind of horse that warriors would fight wars to possess. The stallion was a paint, but unlike any paint Jake had ever seen. Its markings were so perfectly balanced and dramatically colored that they seemed almost supernatural, as if some divine artist had taken brush to canvas rather than nature having worked its random will. The horse's eyes were intelligent and alert, and when it looked at Jake, there was a sense of recognition there, as if it somehow knew that its destiny was about to change. "This is Windwalker," Running Elk said as he handed Jake the lead rope, his voice carrying the weight of great significance. "He is the fastest horse in our herd, brave as a cornered bear and smart as a fox. He has carried me through many battles and never once failed me, never once shown fear in the face of enemy fire or dangerous ground." The chief's hand moved lovingly along the horse's neck as he spoke, clearly reluctant to part with an animal that had been his companion through so many adventures. "But today he belongs to you, as a token of our gratitude for returning what was sacred to us. He will serve you as faithfully as he has served me, and through him you will always carry a piece of our people with you wherever you go." Jake stood among the assembled warriors, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. These weren't just gifts, they were symbols of acceptance, tokens of respect from a people who had every reason to distrust white men, but who had chosen to honor his simple act of decency. The value of what he was receiving was enormous, but their spiritual significance was even greater. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Why go to such trouble? I just found the staff and kept it safe. Anyone would have done the same." Running Elk shook his head gravely, his expression serious and formal. "No," he said firmly, "not anyone. Many who would have found the thunder staff would have seen only its material value, would have sold it to traders or collectors who cared nothing for its sacred nature, who would have melted down the metals and sold the stones without any understanding of what they were destroying." The chief's voice grew harder as he continued, clearly speaking from bitter experience. "Others would have left it in the rocks, thinking that Indian artifacts meant nothing to them, that the beliefs of our people were just superstition and ignorance. Still others would have taken it, but treated it carelessly, allowing it to be damaged or lost again." Running Elk placed his hand on Jake's shoulder, and Jake could feel the strength and warmth in the older man's grip. "You saw something sacred and treated it with the respect it deserved. You wrapped it carefully, secured it safely, and intended to see it return to its rightful owners, even though you gained nothing from doing so. That choice, it speaks to who you are as a man, shows that you have the kind of heart that recognizes what is holy." The chief's expression softened as he continued. "Among our people there is a saying, 'The spirits know the hearts of all men, and they remember those who show respect for what is sacred.' You have shown such respect, and so you are welcomed as a friend to the Ute people, as a brother to all who follow the old ways." The ceremony continued for over an hour, with songs and prayers offered in the Ute language, while the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Jake found himself passed from warrior to warrior, each eager to meet the white man who had earned their respect through his actions rather than his words. Through broken English and universal gestures, the warriors told him stories of the Thunderstaff's history, painting a picture of its significance that helped Jake understand why its return was such a momentous occasion. The staff had been created over a century ago by Thunderwalker, a medicine man of legendary power whose name was still spoken with reverence throughout the tribe. The staff had seen the tribe through many difficulties over the decades, droughts that threatened to destroy their crops, wars with enemy tribes that seemed impossible to win, diseases that swept through their camps like wildfire. Each time, the Thunderstaff had been called upon, and each time the spirits had responded with aid and protection. 20 years ago, during a raid by Cheyenne warriors from the north, the staff had been stolen along with other sacred objects and several captives. The Ute had immediately organized a war party to pursue the raiders, but by the time they caught up, the Cheyenne had scattered and the sacred objects had vanished into the vast wilderness. "You are part of our story now," Running Elk told him as the ceremony drew to a close, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy and tradition. "The Thunder Staff has returned to us through your hands, and that bond can never be broken. You will always be welcome among the Mountain Ute, always have a place by our fires, always be counted as family." As the warriors prepared to leave, Jake felt a strange mixture of loss and fulfillment. He had come into these mountains as a simple cowboy, looking for lost cattle, but he was leaving as something different. A man who had been touched by forces larger than himself, who had participated in something ancient and sacred. Running Elk approached him one final time, carrying the Thunderstaff that Jake had found and protected. The staff seemed to glow in the morning light, as if it were somehow generating its own illumination from within. The carved thunderbird at its tip appeared to be moving, its wings seeming to flex and extend as if it were about to take flight. "This will go back to its place of honor in our most sacred lodge," Running Elk said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "But it will carry with it the story of the white man who treated it with respect, who proved that honor and decency exist in all peoples, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak." The chief raised the staff above his head, and immediately the other warriors began to move, flowing across the mountainside like water flowing downhill. They moved with the silent grace that had made them legendary, their horses' hooves making almost no sound on the rocky ground as they melted back into the landscape that had hidden them so perfectly. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the wilderness as completely as if they had never been there at all, leaving only hoof prints in the dust and the lingering sense of something profound having taken place. Jake stood alone on the mountain peak, surrounded by more wealth than he had ever possessed in his life, still trying to understand what had happened to him. The ride back to the main herd took Jake 2 days, and during that time he had plenty of opportunity to think about what had occurred. Windwalker, the magnificent paint stallion that Running Elk had given him, proved to be everything the chief had promised and more. The horse was not only fast and intelligent, but seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to find his way through difficult country. When Jake finally rejoined the cattle drive, his fellow cowboys gathered around to stare in amazement at the magnificent horse he was leading and the obvious wealth of the gifts he carried. Jake told them the story of finding the Thunderstaff and its return to the Ute, though he left out many of the more mystical details, knowing that most of them would dismiss such things as Indian superstition. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the territory, carried by traders and travelers. The story grew in the telling, but the essential truth remained unchanged. A white cowboy had found a sacred object and had chosen to treat it with respect, and an entire tribe had ridden out to honor him for that choice. Years later, when Jake had become a successful rancher, he would sometimes see smoke signals rising from the mountain peaks, and he would know that Running Elk and his people were still there. The magnificent horse became the foundation of Jake's breeding program, and the other gifts held places of honor in his house. But perhaps the most important gift Jake had received couldn't be seen or held. It was the knowledge that the world was larger and more mysterious than he had ever imagined. The thunderstaff itself had disappeared back into the sacred places where the mountain Ute kept their most precious possessions. But its power lived on in the story that was told around fires both red and white. And sometimes, on clear mornings when the wind was right, Jake would swear he could hear it singing in the distance, the voice of the thunderstaff calling across the mountains, reminding all who knew how to listen that the spirit still watched over those who treated the sacred with the reverence it deserved.